My name is Bali. Welcome to Joy and Truth. Today I want to talk about faith, belief, and miracles. The reason being that over the years I've heard repeatedly, and at one time even I was convinced, that we should not expect miracles as done by Jesus Christ in the first century to be something that we can expect from God today. Of course, it's not outrightly condemned or restricted that they can't happen, but it's in the culture of the faith that I was a part of, anyways. It was not something that we should be convinced it could happen, and even something that we would not necessarily pray about with any diligence. I think I've realized why many people think that God is not doing miracles today on earth. And it may not be because he is no longer doing miracles on earth today. So, what am I talking about? Let's get into it. First, I want to show the scriptural evidence, and it's not just one. So, we're not taking a scripture out of context here. There's many scriptures that we could talk about, but I want to show from the scriptures what indicates that true Christians can expect to see God's goodness in the form of miracles. So, the first one, I'm going to look at Mark chapter 11. This is the account about the lesson from the withered fig tree, and it you notice they passed by in the morning. The Jesus and his apostles, the disciples, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. So earlier, um, what had happened was prior to this, on a previous day, when Jesus came from Bethany, he was hungry. He saw in the distance a fig tree in leaf. He was hungry. So this was not, uh, of course, okay, so let's just focus on the fact that he was hungry. He sees this fig tree and he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it wasn't the season for figs. And he said to him, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." His disciples heard it. Now, that was intentional. But then if you look at what happened after, so he goes and he cleanses the temple, and he comes back. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." This is the whole point. Jesus did it so that they would see it later. Now, later it might be a little bit complicated because Matthew says it happened immediately, but I mean, Mark is the more in-depth account. So, we can assume that it didn't happen right then and there. They left and they came back, and then and Peter noticed it. He said, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." And Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God." It says, "Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him." Then he says, "Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer," whatever. Notice there's no restriction here. This is not just, of course, when we say whatever, we don't mean things that God hates, okay? Like, so maybe we don't have to be so particular about pushing this to that extreme. This is obviously when it says whatever, it's talking about things that God takes pleasure in. So therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received and it will be yours. So he's saying at the time of your requesting, he said, just like I said to the fig tree, be withered, may there never be fruit from you again, and it withered. He's saying, whatever you ask in prayer, the condition for it actually happening is that you need to believe that you have received it. Even though in that moment it's not physically there, just like it's interesting, the fig tree didn't physically wither immediately. He asked, obviously, Jesus believed that God could do it, and then he walked away and he came back and it was done. It was as good as done when he asked. And that's what he's telling them. He said, "Therefore, I tell you, I believe anyways." So I don't want to, I'm not going to be dogmatic about this. I'm sharing my opinion about this, but I feel there's a lot of scriptural evidence for this opinion. So therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. It's not it might be yours, maybe if God was. No, the condition for the receiving it is the believing that when you asked, you got it. This is very interesting. And if you look at, like, does he really mean anything? Well, look at the example he gave here about, he said, "Whoever says to this mountain, truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him." Now, we could take that symbolically. We could say that means the mountain of problems that comes in our life. But why does it always have to be symbolic? Why can't we take Jesus at his word here? He was talking in the context of something physical that just happened with the fig tree. Uh, Now, of course, we know that the fig tree could have been an illustration. Some scholars think it could have been an illustration pertaining to the condition of Israel, and therefore, he's going to open up to the Gentiles and reject Israel, whatever. But The fact is they didn't know that at the time he said that. And the reality is the fig tree did not just symbolically wither, or it actually withered. And he's telling them, and they're saying, they express surprise, like, oh, how did that happen? So he's responding to them. He said, don't be surprised at that. Don't be surprised at that physical thing that I just did, because that physical thing is nothing. In fact, you could say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and don't doubt in your heart. And I think there was another account in the scriptures also talks about, like, you can ask for a mulberry tree to be planted in the ocean, and it would grow if you have faith. So the fact that he said this to them, that it feels certainly that he's talking more about physical things that are possible, that could happen. Now, this idea of belief, and so again, the condition to have a miracle take place is that, or for your prayers to be answered. He said, therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received. Now, the key is to believe despite not having received in that moment. Again, just like the fig tree did not wither in that moment, but believing it had would have been just as good as it having been withered, and that's why he came back. Interestingly, they saw he set this up. Like, I think he set this up. He walked by it, said that, walked by again. He wanted them to see it. Otherwise, what? Why did he do it? So he wanted the disciples to see it. They did see it, and he taught a lesson from it. Okay, so again, this idea of faith or belief being the deciding factor, I believe it's saturated in the scriptures. That belief is the deciding factor, not the circumstances, not necessarily even what's asked, of course, as long as it's not something that God hates. Um, Belief or faith is the deciding factor. So, just as an example, I want to share a sort of a string of proof here. So, that in the end, even Jesus' miracles were based on faith mostly, on the faith of the person receiving the miracle. So not every single time, because he obviously could, it was Christ. He could do things that, independent of the faith others had, or he could do things based on their good desire. But we're just going to generally show a pattern that shows up. If we think about this, that when Jesus started doing his miracles, especially his miracles of healing, what was the predominant means by which Jesus would heal people early on? Well, it said that Jesus himself laid hands on people. So that was the expectation people had, that he would touch them and then they would be healed. And we can look at these. I'm going to include some references below. Look at all these references, and you can see that healing by touching was what people expected. Like, they brought their sick ones to Jesus so that he could touch them. And so it was believed in the minds of the people who needed the healing that they needed to touch Jesus. That's the faith they had. And then he touched them and he healed them. So they were rewarded for their faith. And but I just want to point out that it was their belief in being healed by touch and Jesus being physically present, that belief was rewarded. They showed up to act in harmony with their belief. And again, the belief was not just that Jesus could heal them. The belief in particular was that Jesus could heal them by a touch, and therefore they were rewarded for their belief. But then it gets a little bit more interesting. If you go, and we're going to look at this scripture here in Matthew 9:18. So the first sort of group of healings was touch healings, because that was the belief of the people. But if you look at the account about the lady with the flow of blood for 12 years, it's an amazing account. In fact, The Chosen does quite a touching description of that account in the Bible. But if you look here in Matthew chapter 9, verse 18, it says, and behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years, she came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. Why did she touch the fringe of his garment? Well, it says, for she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I'll be made well. So just a little bit of back history. Of course, can't say definitively, but she was flowing with blood, and she would have been unclean perpetually, basically. And uh, touching anyone, never mind a like prominent religious leader or a religious figure like Christ, would have been something she would have had to wrap her mind around. Like, I can't touch him. Certainly, how can I touch him, make him unclean, and then be clean myself? But she must have reasoned in her heart, if I just touch the, like it says here, the fringe of his garment, the fringe, like the fringe isn't even full garment, so I'm not touching him. Okay, I don't need to touch him. I don't even need to touch his actual solid clothes. I can just touch the fringe, so I'm not even really touching him because the fringe is less dense than the clothing himself. I don't know what went through her mind, but if you imagine that, that would have gone through her mind. Like, and how many people had she made unclean? And she would have tasted that whole experience about making people unclean her whole life, and how disturbing. Like I said, if you haven't seen that account in The Chosen, it'll really drive that point home. But the point is that here her faith was not that if I touch Jesus, like his skin, or that I touch his garment. Her faith said, if I touch just the fringe, I will be healed. So what happens? Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. She was made well. What did Jesus say made her well, though, in this account? Did he say, oh, because you touched me or touched my garment, you're made well? He said, your faith. It was just the faith. But what was her faith? Her faith was that if she touches the fringe, she will be healed. Therefore, when she touched the fringe, she was healed. The faith of the people in the former groups was that if Christ touches us, we will be healed. What happened? When Christ touched them, they were healed. See, we can see here it's not necessarily the mechanism that caused them to be healed. This is fascinating because we're kind of realizing that it wasn't the technique that was used by the person. It was just their belief, which makes you wonder, what if the belief was ridiculous? Like, what if the belief was that neither did you need to touch Jesus and neither did you need to touch the fringe of his garment? In fact, before we move on to that, I just want to say, sometimes our faith is based on what we see having had happened already, right? And this is very interesting because you see the woman with the flow of blood here in another account. Uh, Look what happened, and I'm pretty sure this is after this account. If you look at Matthew 14:34, he said, "And when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all that region and brought him all who were sick. And notice what they wanted, and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well." Now, if my hypothesis is right, that they only wanted to touch the fringe of his garment because she only touched the fringe of his garment, the woman with the flow of blood. Now they had heard about it. They're like, hey, we need to touch the fringe of his garment and we're going to be healed. We don't even need to touch him. Now, this is very interesting. It said, and as many as touched it were made well. Again, what made them well? The touching of the fringe? No, it was their belief. It was their belief that if we touch the fringe of his garment, like she did, I'm hypothesizing here, we will be made well. And then when they did, it happened. Again, it was their belief that 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 would happen that made it happen. It's very natural for us to imitate the faith of others. But again, going back to the former statement, that what if somebody got the idea? Somebody's like, hey, you know what? I'm going to believe that neither does Jesus need to touch me to be healed. I'm going to believe that neither do I need to touch the fringe of his garment to be healed. What am I going to believe? I think you might be onto the account that I'm thinking of. Let's go to the next account. And this shows you this idea of belief is the deciding factor. Whatever it is you believe decides whether you receive or not the mechanism you use. Look at this account here in Matthew 8, verse 5. The faith of a centurion says, when he had entered Capernaum, and remember, this man was not even an Israelite. So when he entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. Now, I think there's a little bit of a like cross in the Gospels. Across the Gospels, you might see an account where he actually sends somebody, sends people to talk to Jesus, and I think that's the more detailed account, probably more descriptive of what actually happened here. I think it's maybe summarizing it, but the point is, when he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. Okay, so Jesus is like, I'll do the typical, where I come and touch him and heal him. But look what the centurion says. The centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. We just passed over into a whole different kind of mechanism. Remember, healing by touching Jesus himself, his skin, healing by touching the fringe of his garment. And now this guy is saying, you know what? You Nobody needs to touch anything. In fact, you can remotely heal him from where you're standing. I don't know how far off he was. I think, look at that. Only say the word and my servant will be healed. Did Jesus say, no, that's not going to work? Like you can do it by touching or by friendship. No, he said, and look at his faith. He said, for I too am a man under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he comes, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. Meaning, like, just like I command my soldiers, like I don't have to touch them, I don't have to push them. You can command this disease to leave him. Something like that from a distance. Look what Jesus said. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those following him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such a faith. And it's true. Like, I don't know exactly when this happened, but it's true. The woman with the flow of blood didn't have that kind of faith. She thought she had to touch the fringe. Other people who felt that Jesus needed to touch them, they didn't have that kind of faith. They felt that Jesus had to touch them physically. This kind of faith, that you just say it and it'll happen. Let it be done for you as you have believed. Again, what's the deciding factor in whether someone receives the answer to their request from God? Belief. And again, in all these situations, see, like Jesus isn't here today among us. But what is among us is the ability to believe, to really believe. Not just believe because we're trying an experiment, but to actually really believe that he's capable of doing it. What would happen if we really believed? I'm going to um, put it out there and say, I think most of us, including myself, don't sometimes don't really believe. And that's why we don't really receive. And it's interesting. If Jesus could have done this, it did this for a Roman soldier, and he said he's not of Israel, and Jesus' main job was to go to the lost sheep of Israel, and he did it for him, would he not have done it for anybody else as well? If the woman with the flow of blood was like, you know what, I'm unclean. By the way, I'm not criticizing her. I'm impressed with her faith. Like, but I'm just saying, she's like, I'm unclean. I can't touch him. But you know what? I can ask somebody to tell him that I'm waiting for his healing, and I believe it can happen. Would it have happened to her? Well, if it happened to the Roman soldier who was not a daughter of Abraham like she was, yeah, of course it would have happened. But her belief was that I need to touch the fringe, and she did. So, so again, it's the faith of the person that decides whether something happens. It's the belief of the person. Again, when Jesus says here in Mark, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received, and it will be yours. See, that thread is there. It's the belief that he can, and that when you asked, it has happened. It's as good as done, and it will be yours. Now, I just want to spend a second here and talk about the atmosphere of faith. So, like, again, to further prove that belief is the precondition for the occurring of things that are beyond normal, like miracles, what we call miracles, is uh, is another account that when Jesus was in Capernaum, if we look at Matthew chapter 13, we know Jesus was in Capernaum, and they said to him, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works?" Not to him, to among themselves. He said, "Is this not the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother called Mary, and are not these his brothers called uh, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? Are not all his sisters with us? Where did this man get all these teachings?" And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and in his own household." And what happened? He did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. So you kind of have this concept of the atmosphere of belief can even prevent miracles. Um, if you think about, like, could it be that where there's an atmosphere of unbelief, even Christ, it's unclear to me from this account whether he prefers not to or he actually doesn't or he can't in an atmosphere of faith. But the point is, it does, there is an indication where there's an atmosphere of disbelief that something can happen, then likely it won't happen. And here you look in this entire town, it seemed like because they knew him from childhood, they didn't believe that he could do the things that he could do, and therefore he didn't do much there. It might even have been because he couldn't do much there. I know that sounds crazy, but lack of faith would repel any miracles that could have happened there. So atmosphere of belief is important too. And so certainly if we live in a society that teaches that miracles don't happen today, God doesn't do miracles, and or maybe we're taught that from our religious background. Well, then what exists in your life? It's an atmosphere of disbelief. And can anything happen in that atmosphere of disbelief? No. Like this account here in Capernaum shows like where there's disbelief because of their unbelief, it's not going to happen. Believing is a precondition. I also want to just talk about why doing what it says here in Mark 11. You know, in Mark 11, I'm going to go back there. Why is this hard? I thought about it. Why is it hard for me? Uh, this idea. Whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received, that will be yours. And you know, let's say you're going through something, and now what would this practically look like? Well, practically might look like in prayer, you know, dear God, like here's the situation I'm facing. This is for your will. This is, you know, so you pray and ask, make your request. And now, what does it mean that you believed? There's almost a fear that I'll lose my faith in God then, because the scripture is pretty clear, right? He says, whatever you ask in prayer, believe you have received, and it will be yours. Now I tried to follow his word. This you can't really get around this idea that this is what he's saying. Whatever, first of all, you ask in prayer, believe that you have received and it will be yours. So now what if now again it's the disbelief that kills you. So it's like what if but for a genuine Christian, you know, believing what it says here in Mark 11 verse 20, you know, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it will be yours. It can be very hard. And I don't think it's hard because people are faithless. Um, I don't think it's hard because, you know, somebody's not a spiritual person. One reason there may be a fear, and the fear might be like, okay, look, what does this practically mean? This practically means that if I need something that's good in the eyes of God and I ask him for it in prayer, I should believe that I've received it, and then it's going to be mine. But committing to that belief has consequences when we think about it, you know, when we're thinking about whether we're going to do this or not. And I know because I went through this myself. When you actually say this, the thought comes up, well, what if it doesn't happen? And I gave my belief. I put it on the line. I believe the scripture because you can't really get around the scripture. It's saying what it's saying. You ask if it's in harmony with God's, not, if it's something good in the eyes of God, it will be done for you. Believe that you've received yours. And what if it doesn't happen? Then what's the risk? I might lose my relationship with God. So the real fear, I think, why some may not do it. Of course, our religious background can, you know, maybe discourage us from doing these kinds of things. But in addition to that, it may be if it doesn't happen the way I expected it to happen, I'll lose my faith in God. And that's a way worse position to be in than right now. Right now, you know, like there's no clear proof, but this would be clear proof if he fulfills his promises as is written in the scriptures. So it's naturally just not. It's naturally just easier to not ask in belief because if you ask in belief, the disappointment if it doesn't happen is as you think about it, the disappointment if it doesn't happen is higher, and the risks are higher, the stakes are higher, and we might feel that, hey, you know what, if this doesn't happen, I'm going to lose the thing I'm most wanting to protect, namely my relationship with God. So I think it's actually coming from a good place. It's actually coming from like, I don't want to lose my relationship with God because if this thing doesn't happen, or if I'm misinterpreting the scripture, and you know, I might be discouraged. But remember, um, what's the precondition to any miracle happening according to Mark chapter 11 and all the other accounts that we discussed about the woman with the flow of blood, all the healings of the precondition was belief. Belief was the precondition. So going back, a possible reason we don't experience the kinds of things that happened in the first century today is because of an atmosphere of disbelief. And what created that atmosphere of disbelief? It's kind of funny. We might have created it by teaching that God is not doing these things today. But as soon as you teach that, and then you look around and you say, okay, yeah, they're not happening. Well, our teaching must be correct. We said that God is not doing things today, these miracles today, and we look around ourselves and say, God, oh yeah, they're not happening today. So that checks out. No. What if you created that disbelief? And if the precondition for miracles happening is belief, then that's a self fulfilling prophecy. Because if something requires believing for it to happen, and you have accepted that it doesn't happen, then you've lost the precondition for any miracle to happen. So just think about that. If belief is a requirement before getting an answer, a miraculous answer from God, and you currently believe that He's not doing that sort of thing today, then you might be missing the most essential piece in receiving. Anyway, I just had to share that. Again, these are just my viewpoints as I read the scriptures, but that's what they say. Can you imagine, just in conclusion here, that what if it was actually possible? Jesus said something like along the lines of, "Will I really find faith in this world at a future time?" And it could be that we live in a very faithless world. It could be that we rely so much on what we know or scientific knowledge to current scientific knowledge and we hedge our bets on that. We think nothing beyond that can happen. Well, that's also a form of belief. If you believe that only what science has revealed to be true is what can happen, then that's all. That's all that's going to happen. But just end it with Mark 11:24. We can skirt around the scripture as much as we want, but the scripture says, "Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours."